What's up, guys? It is Saturday, not Friday. I have to get that out of my head. It's Friday. I normally post the show up on Friday nights, but it's going up on Saturday. Today, Saturday, November 21st, 2020, and this is another edition of the FritzCast, and I'm very excited to keep the intro short and sweet this week because I just wrapped up a very in-depth, meaty, juicy conversation with my guest this week, Kevin Vallier. Kevin Vallier wrote this book, Trust in a Polarized Age, something they started working on back in 2015, I think. And trust in a polarized age, if you think about where we're standing as a nation right now in the United States after two very divisive election cycles in 2016 and 2020, we are, as I've been trying to state time and again, we are divided. There's a problem going on. Kevin Vallier's written about it. Written about it. Kevin Vallier is an associate professor of philosophy at Bowling Green State University. He directs the philosophy, politics, economics, and law programs. And Trust in a Polarized Age isn't the only book that he's written. He's written Must Politics Be War? He's written dozens of other scholarly articles and other written work. He's done lectures. There's plenty of resources on YouTube that I could give you. But Kevin's people reached out to me and wanted to come on the show, which I take as humbling because somebody wants to come on my show. I always take that as something that's just I'm always amazed when somebody wants to come on the show. I do a lot of outreach. I get a lot of people to come on the show, but when somebody reaches out and wants to come on, that's just, it's special to me. It means something. It means a whole nother layer of it, and I'm very glad that I had the opportunity to have Kevin on for this discussion because it's a very important matter. Let's face it. We all live in America. This is the world that we live in, and whether you like it or not, whether you like Donald Trump or not, you Trumpies out there who are all in on the election was stolen by Joe Biden, and for you Joe Biden folks who are thinking that January 26th, whatever the inauguration day is, for those of you on the left who are thinking that from January whatever, from when Biden is inaugurated on, is going to be steps back to normalcy. Well, the conversation that me and Kevin have lead to the fact that there's some hard work that's going to have to be done to walk ourselves back that way. So without keeping this stalling thing going on, because stalling is stupid and dumb, we're not going to stall anymore. You're about to hear Kevin Vallier on the FritzCast. Thanks for tuning in. All right, Kevin, welcome to the FritzCast.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate you coming on. Very good topic to discuss today. But before we dive into that, and because it's a big meaty subject, just tell my audience a little bit about who you are and what you do.
So I'm Kevin Vallier. I'm a philosopher at Bowling Green State University, and I do primarily political philosophy, ethics, and philosophy, politics, economics, or what these days is called PPE. I've done a lot of research in religion and politics, some writing there. And these days, I'm particularly concerned with how societies develop the ability to trust each other, and how they become more trusting or less trusting depending on changes in culture and institutions. I mean, the fundamental thing that I'm interested in is trying to figure out how people can be reconciled to one another despite having deep differences of opinion about politics, for religion, morality, and so on. So I even have my blog, Reconciled. I mean, it's even about all of those things. So I mean, in effect, everything I'm interested in is how do diverse people coordinate how do they live well to each other? How do they live well together if they can?
That's actually throughout probably, I guess, the past two election cycles. That's been a big subject that's popped up on my mind because I don't think you could find a more divisive, polarized time than right now. It seems, at least, anyway.
Yeah. The Civil War is the last time we had this much polarization in politics. We've obviously had other kinds of social conflicts since then, but in terms of political polarization, yeah, we're at a unique point in our history that's this bad, but simultaneously not an actual civil war.
Yeah, I keep hearing people refer to it as like a cold civil war
Yes,
almost.
Cold War, and that we're not attacking each other openly. A civil war, and that we're against each other. I like that term.
Yeah, and then just I want to dive in because we're going to talk about your book right here, Trust in a Polarized Age. Some of the statistics that go into this. Back in the 70s, half of Americans said most people could be trusted. It's less than a third now. In the 60s, it was 70% of Americans trusted the federal government always or most of the time. Now it's only 17%.
Yeah, it's fallen dramatically.
And then the other aspect of this is the 2017 numbers. The parties were mirror images of each other. 70% of Republicans distrusted anyone voting for Clinton, and 70% of Democrats distrusting anyone who voted for Trump. It's definitely like we're definitely in a very heightened gridlock era right now.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. It's particularly a fascination to me, not just as a political or real world problem. How do we deal with the situation? What's bad about it? How do we get out of it? But also that it raises a kind of philosophical challenge in the minds of many people, which is, is this all politics is? Is that all it can be? So, there's two kinds of questions that come up, this practical one and then this kind of more abstract one that I'm interested in.
Right. And with that, what got you into wanting to study this? Is it because that you're in the middle of living it, and this is to a degree where this isn't just people saying like we're not going to talk about politics at the dinner table anymore. This is where people have heated exchanges like almost over anything. Coworkers have heated exchanges over politics. Everything. I believe one of your lines is from the book is politics is swallowing everything else. It becomes this front runner issue, whereas I think there was probably a day and age where it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or a Republican or a conservative or a liberal or a progressive. At some point, I guess the tides turned, and now it's like that's our own self-identity.
Yeah, we have fewer what some call cross-cutting identities. But this has been one consequence of secularization in the United States, which has proceeded nowhere near as far as it has in Europe. And still a lot of people do go to church regularly, but the number of people who are prepared to admit, at least, that they are not religious believers can be quite polarized on the left. But on the right, people can be quite polarized, even if they self-identify as Christian, but typically if they don't go to church very much. So there are a lot of people who call themselves evangelical because they, quote, got saved or whatever at 16, but maybe they haven't gone to a church except on Christmas or Easter. So they're effectively secular in any case. So I think one kind of deep identity that's decayed is religious identity. And in many cases, political identity just determines religious identity. There's some good evidence on this that as people filter into the Democratic Party, they go to church less, and as people filter into the Republican Party, they go to church more. So politics is kind of wagging religion, and that's extremely sad because, I'm sure some of the people who get involved in developing a worldview or a system of values I would like to think they developed them because, they found some meaning in their lives, when probably what's going on is they just followed the tribe and the practices of the tribe that they joined, red or blue.
Yeah, the tribalism. I actually like how you put the mirror in there with religion. I would be fascinated to see if you kind of agree with this. It seems more and more as people kind of wane or falter in their faith, that they're looking for something to replace it that's like
right.
more concrete, more evident in their lives. Is this like people making the government kind of their god almost?
I mean, a lot of people think that language is exaggerated, but I've seen some research that suggests that it's actually not as exaggerated as you might think, because we think of being religious oftentimes as being very religious, but most people aren't and have never been very religious. So what it means for their government to be their religion isn't like, oh, government, I love thee kind of thing, right? It's actually just a commitment to seeing it as that there's a fundamental source of order in the universe, and that it is best to be in tune with or go along with that order. And I think in many very secular countries, this was true under communism, but in many cases, religion was so violently suppressed, it's hard to know. The secularization process wasn't natural, like in Russia, for instance. And indeed, many of the Eastern European countries are becoming more religious after communism. In fact, I believe there'll be a day in the next 30 years or so where more Russians claim to be Christians than Americans, which is, stunning if you think about it. But in the Scandinavian countries where secularism has progressed the most far, there does seem to be some evidence that the social democratic state is playing a role that religion played. Although, interestingly enough, there have been attempts to estimate religiosity in Europe in previous centuries. And it may actually be the case that the Scandinavians were actually less religious overall, even going some time back. Some people have tried to measure things like frequency of church attendance by looking at the way churches were constructed that are still around. We don't know a lot about the past, and also with religiosity. I mean, what did a 17th century so-called, Christian in, Cornwall or Breton or, all those little, little areas, what do they know? I mean, they heard a mass in Latin. No one gave them any formal teaching. In many cases, their priests knew absolutely nothing. So, it's hard to know exactly whether we were like super religious and then came down. The best evidence we have from the United States is that American religiosity goes in cycles. So, we have great awakenings. And that the U.S., for whatever reason, is capable of extreme levels of religiosity. So, for instance, around the Civil War, I read a book by a Civil War historian, Jim McPherson, some years ago, where he described the content of the letters of the Confederate and Union soldiers. And he made the remark that this may have been the most two religious armies that he'd ever even heard of historically, given how much they, but the Second Great Awakening had a huge effect. Around the time of the Revolution, people weren't going to church. They're going to church about as often, maybe less often than they do now. Part of that just means they live far apart. Maybe it's hard to get to church, so maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe it isn't a great comparison. But one thing that happened after the end of the Second World War is that a whole bunch of people started going to church regularly. So the country actually became more religious during that time period. That's when we added "In God We Trust" in coins. That's when we added "Under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. Part of it was a reaction to communism, defining ourselves against them. Part of it was seen about becoming suburban. You get your GI Bill, you go to college, you move in the suburbs, you find a church. But that didn't actually complete itself. So what happened was in the 60s and the 70s, there was a great awakening of a non-Christian sort on the left. And this was, I think, a very religious and spiritual movement. New Age spirituality came into being, right? This accompanied, the widespread use of drugs and, spending a lot of time with music, which is also key to religion. So I see the 50s, 60s, and the 70s as a kind of intensely religious period. It's just that there becomes this new religious division. You have a small Great Awakening in the 80s and the 90s with the revivals. And now we're kind of coming down from that, but the hippies' kids are undergoing another spiritual awakening, what some call this Great Awakening. But in this case, the Great Awakening is entirely political or obsessed with politics. And the salvation of humanity relies in realizing relations of equality and the overthrow of oppression by race, gender, sexuality. And on top of that, there is no belief in real mercy, forgiveness, or reintegration into the community, and a belief that the situation we're in is inevitable, that oppression can never really be gotten rid of. It's a little bit like original sin without any forgiveness. But I think it has all the central elements of kind of litany of behaviors, that you see, in religion. They haven't done like the old socialists did and invented their own music yet, like the International. But so I see what's going on in the United States as now politics is very much like a religion. It's happening over the past few decades, but we're a very spiritual people. And for the most part, that spirituality has been Christian. But today it is not. Today, the great awakening among elites is the social justice, spirituality or system of ultimate values. So I see it.
Right. And then is there any period of time where this is this is kind of unique in its own
Yes.
time, right? It doesn't mirror any other time period that we know of in written history, at least anyway.
No, its obsession with politics is unique. You do still have extremely doctrinaire old communists, but they were mostly active outside the United States. Marxism was a religion substitute in Eastern Europe and for many in Western Europe, but it never got very far in the US. It never got very far outside of the academy. The United States did not have anything like a successful socialist movement. So it was never a very large portion of the populace. But for many, many countries, Marxism was a religion substitute, but just not here. So what we're seeing now is a kind of progressivism. It's less concerned with class. It's not all that concerned with economics. It's concerned with cultural revolution, but within the structure of institutions that we have. And so, what we see, for instance, is the corporate world moving sharply left on social justice issues. You remember I was in Toronto for I think Pride Week a few years ago, and all the corporations in Toronto had rainbow flags or rainbow lights. They all just went on board. So they go from being non-political to being pretty political in many cases, very, very strongly so. And that's not to say whether their values are correct or incorrect. It's simply to say this is the pattern. But I think what's really unique is it's really two things. The hippies believed that you could actually realize more equality, like that oppression wasn't inevitable. They also believed in forgiveness and reconciliation. And the Christians kind of always believed in, reconciliation and the ability to make social progress to some degree. I mean, you have the Augustinian denominations that were more skeptical of this, like the Calvinists and the Lutherans, but still social progress could be made. But the kind of social justice movement that you see today, it is merciless, it does not forgive without total submission. It's fundamentally nihilistic in the sense that it thinks things really can't get better. So that's what I find especially disturbing. But if you notice with this pattern, there is in the background the fact that oppression has to be overcome, but it can never truly be overcome. That sort of keeps people going. It sometimes demoralizes them, but you're never done, right? And you never expect to be done, right? So it can drive you forever. And always be a source of meaning because you're always fighting the patriarchy, right? You're always fighting racism. You're always fighting to be anti-racist, always, at every moment of every day until you die. So it is unique in those regards, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, what you're speaking to, in case anybody in the audience is at a loss here, cancel culture, playing into the, as you say, wokeism. I mean, and it's very unrelenting and unforgiving because you can see where basically, I mean, it's probably more so prominent with public figures and celebrities when they have done something. Twitter
is ground zero for a lot of this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Alex Jones got completely wiped off of Twitter.
Lots of people have been wiped off that were, I think, less deliberately provocative than he was. And I should add, I think one thing I've been surprised by is I understood people who were big fans of Trump in a way, but they're very recently. I have been concerned since the election. I kind of thought people would be fans, but they wouldn't it wouldn't be devoted in this kind of very strange way. I mean, I always thought of Trump devotion as kind of fear of the left and hatred of the left, in the sense that Trump was the only thing that could stop them, in the sense that Trump was the only person who really had the courage, the stones to not care about what they thought. So now I'm a bit more concerned, but I don't think it will maybe last very long. So I don't want to say there aren't these things on the right. I do think oftentimes the right substitutes things like patriotism of a certain kind. Like you saw this, for instance, with the war on terror and 9/11, and did you forget about 9/11 and, all this kind of stuff. But it feels to me mostly reactive in a sense. And a lot of the people that are Trump supporters really do, I think, have more cross-cutting identities than people on the left, because they may actually be going to church, just doing something a little bit different, unless it's one of those MAGA churches, like the big mega churches that have lost a lot of their theological content. But yeah, the driving force of much social change is this kind of, great awakening, this kind of move towards a kind of unrelenting, merciless pursuit of social justice.
Yeah, and I would have to think that this is very bad precedent that is being laid out in our society, with allowing it to continue, at least anyway, because if there is no forgiveness, if there's no chance at redemption, if you're going to get caught by the mob, so to speak, and they're going to hang you out to dry. I mean, you even said this a little bit earlier when you said that it's unrelenting and it's punish focused. And at times it's not forgiving. At times there is no coming back from it. You're going to get the consequences of it, and you're going to have to live with it, almost, because there's no path back to being forgiven from it.
And I mean, my view about this is that that's one of the main drivers of polarization, because it starts at the elite level, and then I think it filters down to the politically attentive portion of the public. So my view is that, like, polarization is worse at the top, and then it diminishes the lower end status hierarchies you get. So, when you get to the white working classes or the Black or Hispanic working classes, they often actually don't pay very much attention to politics at all, and are, I think, in many respects less polarized. So for instance, I mean, the average Black American is a moderate Democrat. I mean, they're pretty socially conservative. The Hispanic population is too. Like, they don't like the Latinx label or never heard of it or whatever. It's primarily a white phenomenon, really radical polarization. It's primarily people with college degrees, and then people in positions of power in the corporate world, in the academy, in the arts, and in politics. And there's just as much of it on the right as the left at the party level. But my sense is that a lot of the change is driven of what's on the right. And I think this is driving a pattern of distrust in the general population, because the thought becomes that the only reason you would be for one side or the other is because they're immoral, misinformed, or both. And so that's why I do think there were a lot of people that were shy Trump voters this time, in the sense they voted Republican down ballot. Some of them ended up voting Republicans, which is why the polls underestimated them. Some, I think, were actually too worried about Trump, so they voted for Biden, but then they voted Republican down ticket, which is actually unusual. It's becoming less and less common, because of people usually vote straight ticket for them, and particularly in polarized times, they vote straight tickets. So yeah, I think not that there's, I mean, I didn't vote for Trump, and I had a lot of issues with him as a kind of limited government person. So, I think that's one of the main cultural drivers of falling trust. In fact, just before we got on the podcast, I was running through some data on trust, and there are some countries that have lost a lot of social trust. But they're primarily countries that have transitioned from dictatorship to democracy recently. So Poland, Chile, Spain, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, Mexico, quasi one party state to actual competitive democracy. And one of the reasons I think this happens in those countries is because people are kind of told a lot about how great democracy is, and they get disappointed. Or when there's bad policy, if it's a democracy, you blame half the country rather than blaming the junta in power, right? Junta in power. But as far as I can tell, the United States is the only major developed country where social trust has fallen considerably without some kind of major, dramatic institutional change. And so I was just reviewing the data from the sort of main developed countries of what we have. And I think that's because of this phenomenon of polarization and partisan distrust. And I think both phenomena, polarization and falling trust, are driving one another. So my main thesis in the book is that there's this sort of distrust divergence loop. We become further apart, we come to trust each other less, we trust each other less, then we move further apart because we're less likely to listen to each other and take each other seriously. And the only way to disrupt the loop is, I think, to work within the sort of liberal democratic capitalist framework that we have. And there are various kinds of, fairly ordinary policies that can be adopted to really help things. I don't know if they'll turn things around, but they'll certainly be better than not having those policies. And I think it would be worse to go for some kind of populism, because I think that leans into partisanship. Like it leans into, there's an in group and there's an out group, right? On the left, it's, the 99% versus the 1%. On the right, it's kind of immigrants versus everybody else or whatever. So one of my main messages in the book is that we need to stay liberal. And there's a lot of things we can do within, not liberal in the sense of progressive, right? But liberal in the sense of believing in individual and group liberty, believing in limited government. You can be liberal and not necessarily be a big fan of markets. That's maybe a liberal socialist, but you still believe in like principles of free speech, freedom of religion, and that kind of thing. And I think that liberal group is actually declining in influence because it didn't reproduce itself very effectively, even though it thought it was. So like what's going on at the New York Times, where the older liberals are fighting against younger progressives on a variety of issues, and that's spilled out to the public. But I also think it's happened with some of the traditional centrist liberals on Fox News who've been ferociously attacked by Trump supporters, to the point where you can't even say that Trump lost. Many of them people are afraid to say that he lost. So what you're seeing is these kind of two illiberal populations that get a lot of meaning in their lives from trying to tear each other to pieces. Yeah. And that's very perverse, and it's making all of our institutions work less well. And that's also, the institutions working less well is feeding into the populism, because the sense is that, oh, well, look, all our institutions are corrupt. So we need radical change. We have to vote for an outsider, Bernie, Trump, or whatever. And then, Trump comes in and he's worse in many ways with respect to corruption. I mean, I'm one of those people who thinks that it's more important to look at the policy changes and things that happen in administration than rhetoric. I do think rhetoric matters. But I am one of those people very worried about Trump with norm erosion, because, however problematic democracy may be versus some kind of ideal, it's the best thing we figured out how to actually do. So democracies are just better protectors of individual freedoms than non-democracies. Perhaps there's some possible limited government regime that one could have, but for now, the best we've figured out how to protect basic human rights is by letting people throw the bums out. If you can't throw the bums out, they're usually worse. Even if you can only replace them with a different set of bums, they behave a little bit better.
Right.
Yeah.
More accountability to the public, at least, anyway.
Yes, that's the idea. Yeah.
So
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, with that in mind, because something very interesting that you said, you said you believe this starts from the top and then flows down.
Yeah.
I've always talked of politics, everything that I see, especially when we're talking federal politics, maybe not so much state politics, but when we talk federal politics, I always liken it to like watching pro wrestling on TV right now. I feel like they're putting on a dog and pony show for us.
Yeah.
It's playing to the bases. Yeah, very performative, playing to the bases. And we kind of see that already because, as you said, you can't say that Trump has lost the election because obviously if you're on Team Trump, you've got to be all on board on this. The election was rigged, stolen, hacked, whatever word you want to use.
Yeah.
But and while people on Trump's side, while other Republicans are playing that on the news. Lindsey Graham, for example, you might catch him giving Kamala Harris a fist bump on the Senate floor just a couple days ago.
Right, precisely.
So they've obviously done this performative thing. Do you think this performative politics has directly played into this deterioration of trust in the system? Because a lot of us are looking at it and thinking like, oh, they're screwing around anyway. They're horsing
They're
around.
fakes. Right. They're dishonest.
They're characters.
Yeah, there's few things that hurt trust more than things like public corruption. And also, I think a big thing is when people think that their leaders are dishonest, which is just a way of being untrustworthy. So the performativeness introduces a kind of fake character. So, one way that I think our politics would be a lot better is if we had a parliamentary system without party primaries. Because when you have party primaries, they encourage the celebrity kind of behavior rather than the backroom deals where they pick someone electable. And the parties actually offer different platforms because the parties are about platforms rather than about, who's famous. And I also think that the nice thing about parliamentary democracies, instead of a winner take all system, like for us, if someone wins 51% of the vote, say in a congressional race, they win everything. We're say in the UK, you vote for the party, you get 30%, or so of the vote, you get 30% of the seats in parliament. So you get more than two parties, which I think is good for depolarizing. You also see the major parties oftentimes have to go into coalition with other parties. And so they have to publicly compromise in front of the public. And I think that's also good. Here's another thing that's peculiar, but very fascinating. It turns out all else equal, countries with toothless monarchs tend to have more social trust than those without them. And one hypothesis as to why this is that when people can all identify with a single nonpartisan figure, there's a source of unity that does not exist in countries with the highest status people or members of a particular side or team. So for instance, you had Queen Elizabeth, if you have Queen Elizabeth around, she's, we know privately that she seems to kind of lean conservative and seems to, actually be what I've heard is, fairly devout, but she didn't talk about it, right? So you can sort of think, well, Tony Blair's in, or Margaret Thatcher's in, or, Boris Johnson or Gordon Brown or, Theresa May or whatever. But, there's a royal family and, they're neutral. So we have that. And because they're toothless politically, they don't get involved in the fray because they have no power. And I think this happens like in Denmark and with a lot of the toothless royal families in Europe. Because there's at least something that everyone can say, okay, we all like that, everybody loved Princess Diana, right?
Right.
Like I've been watching The Crown lately, looking at the fact checks and stuff that people do. But we don't have that. Our high status people have all taken a side, with the exception of a few wonderful people like Dolly Parton. But there's, just try to think about someone who's famous and who's beloved across the political spectrum. You had Mr. Rogers.
Right.
He was an example. He was a Presbyterian minister, but people didn't pay any attention to that. It's just really hard to think of someone that is universally beloved but that hasn't taken a side. Everyone in Hollywood's taken a side, and if they're conservative, they get excoriated or even slightly right-leaning, like Chris Pratt, for instance, just getting shut down. That's a problem. You want to be able to think of, okay, these are good folks. I don't know their politics, doesn't matter. They're great. You want more nonpartisan elites. And I think that can help people trust each other because they think, look, we've all got something in common. But unfortunately, in the US, we don't seem to have that.
If you hadn't asked that question, I wouldn't have probably wouldn't have even crossed my mind to even think about it. But now that I'm sitting here going through just name after name after name, I'm like, nope, I can think of at least, 3 of my friends who will say something about that person because of something that they said politically.
Yeah.
Or some tweet that they put out. So, something in my mind that's trivial, but it's apparently it's not as trivial as I think it is, at
No,
least not on
they're in the wrong
the
group.
grander scale. Yeah.
They're in the wrong group. That makes,
Yeah.
now you got to worry about them.
It's truly incredible to think about that. And that harkens to, there's a statistic here that I wanted to look at. It was actually from Pew Research in 2019. Because the way that they mapped this data, they mapped it from the highest level of trust and confidence in the system to the lowest levels. And it's amazing how sharply it goes from,
By age.
good. Yeah. And age as well.
Yeah. The age thing is actually the thing that's the most dramatic. So let me say two things about that. First, the oldest people are the ones with the highest level of trust. So that they'll say 60%, 60% or so, or maybe, it's actually in reversed in this Pew poll. So 30% of people over 65 say most people cannot be trusted. Okay. But that number doubles from 18 to 29-year-olds, and it shifts. Now, you might respond to that and say, well, maybe people are mistrustful when they're young and they become more trusting as they get older. But there's some recent evidence to suggest that people's social trust levels actually harden in early adulthood. And so what's going on is that each generation is that the 18 to 29-year-olds are probably going to be low trust for good. And that means, we're passing out of the period of particularly unity in World War II, which I think had a huge effect on trust. Then you have, a couple decades where sort of everyone's doing well. A lot of the cultural cleavages are not associated with politics exactly, because you have a lot of the racist issues, but that's internal to the Democratic Party for the most part. It's not, because the Republican Party had no base in the South to organize. There's no organizational basis. In many cases, Democrats just ran unopposed. So, until Nixon, the race thing, there were hardcore anti-racists, Northern Democrats, hardcore racists, and Southern Democrats. Republicans tended to be a lot more anti-racist than the Southern Democrats, but maybe a little less than the Northern Democrats. So we had a lot of social strife, but then around Vietnam and Nixon, things started to shift, particularly as the Republican Party took over the South. And that's really when a lot of polarization started getting off the ground with Southern realignment, because the Republicans became a competitive major party and not just a permanent minority that oftentimes held the presidency. The Democrats controlled the House from the early 1950s to 1994. So that's really when things started to take off, and that's also around the same time that social trust began to fall. It was in the early 70s. So that's part of my hypothesis that there's something about American partisanship that is poisonous, and that does not appear in other countries. So actually earlier today I was looking at some statistics, some attempts to measure political polarization across nationally. We have some really good measures in the United States, but there hasn't been as much work on cross-national comparisons. And our level of polarization is just an outlier. It's just really high. Some societies have become less polarized. UK has become a bit more polarized, but there's no one that really compares to us in the democratic world, at least among the group that was being analyzed in this. So my hypothesis is that falling social trust, falling political trust, and greater political polarization are all connected. And there are plausible causal channels that run between those three sets of attitudes. So we've talked about some of the causal channels, but that's really what I see. And I'm worried because it looks like the average person will become less trusting. One of the things I need to pay more attention to, it's just not always, the US, it's a multiracial society in the way that many European countries aren't. So the polling doesn't always break down trust attitudes by race. But the little bit I've seen is that Black trust in the people as a whole is at about 17%. Whereas white trust is at about 46%. Black Americans are the only group that, as far as I know, trust the federal government more than they trust most people, which actually makes a lot of sense in their case, because the federal government extricated them from local tyranny with the Civil Rights Act. and that's how it was perceived. And I actually think that's how, just about the story went. So I think it makes sense. I mean, I understand why there's that attitude, but I think it hurts a lot of racial minorities to distrust the majority because you end up interacting with them less. In particular, it hurts economically because when you trust fewer people, you exchange with them less. So even if the low trust attitude is rational, it can also be costly at the same time. And that's the irony of people in low trust communities, no matter their race, no matter their gender, is that, when you're low trust, your life goes worse. Unless, of course, you trust and someone betrays you, and then it's even worse, which is why trust is a kind of collective action problem, right? I mean, it's like, if you put yourself out there, you might get hurt. If you distrust, you won't get hurt as much, but you'll get hurt. But if you trusted the trustworthy, then you would do better. So the best world is when you trust when others are trustworthy, then, when you don't trust when others are untrustworthy, and then when you don't trust when others are, you trust when others are untrustworthy, right? Because then you get betrayed. So ideally, people are trustworthy and are trusted, but that's hard to do. A lot of what I talk about in the book is just how to make institutions more trustworthy by changing incentives, and also ways of making policy changes that will hit sources of distrust and reduce them. So one thing I talk about, and I think this will be kind of something friendly, very friendly to your audience, is we need to deregulate housing construction considerably, particularly in large cities. And there's a couple of reasons that we want to do this from a trust perspective. Number one, because the division of labor can extend better and more people can actually afford to live in cities. Lower middle class people have more choices of jobs, and through competition in the market, they will be able to get higher paying jobs. They'll also be able to go to the higher paying jobs in cities, which will increase economic growth for everybody because the economy becomes more productive, but it also helps poorer people. And it's an upward redistribution. So, the rich are taking from the poor with the not in my backyard stuff, right? San Francisco liberals dramatically jacking up the prices of their homes because their homes are assets, and making it impossible for poor people to live there. Promising them a minimum wage that really doesn't help them. They get fired or not hired or reduced hours. That's one thing that would help, is people would feel like their personal economic prosperity would help, and they trust government more in that regard. But also it would help the left trust more, because it would bring about more economic equality at the same time, because the rich couldn't redistribute from the poor in order to keep their housing prices high. So you get things that libertarians, conservatives, and progressives would all simultaneously like. And there aren't a lot of policies that can do that. But it's a tough thing, because particularly limited government people like things to be done at the local level. But having housing zoning done at the local level, it's very easy to capture those regulatory bodies. So we might need real estate decisions being made at the state level rather than the local level. But that's one kind of policy change that I think would make a lot of people happier. You get more growth, you get more quality. But then, people might say, oh, well, you don't want to trust the government because the government's bad. Well, it depends on what the government's doing. And it depends on what parts of the government are active and what people are trusting them to do. So, the main thing that I worry about, as a kind of limited government person, is war. And, just mass death, usually based on lies, and accomplishes nothing. I don't necessarily want to trust the executive branch to make better decisions about who to bomb. On the other hand, I do want to trust certain parts of the government, because I think they'll behave better if they're trusted and if people are kind of paying attention to what they're doing. I want the CDC to be more effective and to be more trusted. I want, I'm very careful about this, I want the Federal Reserve to be more trusted. Very simple reason. If we get rid of the Fed, we're not going to have a gold standard or free market money. We're going to have Congress doing more fiscal stimulus. So, one thing I think limited government people need to be more careful with is about targeting their distrust, because sometimes sowing distrust in one group makes a worse group more powerful. So want to distinguish between what parts of government we trust. We want to be careful that our trust is, we recognize that our trust attitudes can affect things for the better. I think many politicians are very narcissistic. They're afraid to be publicly shamed and distrusted, and that actually motivates them to behave a little bit better. Not that they'll behave well, but,
Right.
but a little bit better. Yeah. So we have to focus, our distrust, and we have to be very aware of what the likely alternatives are. You could say, look, the Federal Reserve is way better at managing recessions, so screw it up. But than Congress. For Congress, the money will just go to stupid places, right? But at least with the Federal Reserve System, it will go to reasonable places sometimes. And the Federal Reserve, the people who are in it are not idiots, and they're not evil. They just, a lot of them are, sophisticated but mistaken economists. So, I, don't want to say just trust government in general and no matter what it does. I want to be very clear about that. But I do think that limited government people would be more advised to have a subtler set of attitudes. So, I do want to trust government to do things more like get out of the way and allow the economy to grow, right? Like just don't do things that slow growth, because growth compounds and it usually redounds to most of us. And so, you really don't want to slow down the economic growth rate. There's another thing that I think people should consider, which is that government doesn't just grow larger when it's trusted. Sometimes it's easier to shrink, because when you're lower trust, you oftentimes, there's some new evidence on this suggests that lower trust societies are more eager to regulate because they are less likely to trust people to do the right thing when they aren't looking. A lot of high trust countries were able to dramatically shrink how much the government was involved in the economy, like Sweden, whereas we were not able to do that, even though our government was nowhere large as theirs. They still have a large government because they redistribute a lot. But they have very free markets. And they were able to sell off a huge number of state assets to deregulate their economy considerably. And I think that's harder, our country, if someone, not that Swedish politics is all nice or anything, but if someone on the right proposes a tax cut, people don't scream in apocalyptic terror that we're going to be living in an oligarchy, right? I mean, it's just like, oh, yeah, that's a messed up policy, or that's wrong, or boy, I really hate that guy. Instead of the entire world will come to an end if we lower the marginal tax rate by 5%.
Right.
Like Pelosi called the Trump tax cuts, what did she call it? Like one of the most apocalyptic, evil bills like ever. And it was just like getting our corporate tax rate to where it is in most of the developed world. So, that's the difference. It's also the difference that once the election is over, people can just kind of go back to life. You know what I mean? I mean, that's one of the things I dislike the most about Trump is that he is so good at keeping us all thinking about him. And,
right. Yep.
I wish, whatever you might think about him, maybe he's a bulwark against something worse. Maybe you think like me that he's sort of corrosive on the whole. I want to be able to not pay attention better. I mean, I know I have self-control, right? Like I know that I could just choose not to watch, but it's so, like either fascinating or horrifying, and about 5% of the time hilarious, So yeah, it's hard to look away. Biden will be, I think, pretty boring. The big question is whether the people who staff his administrative roles tend to be centrists or hardcore progressives. If they're hardcore progressives, it's going to be, some of these places, it's going to cause a lot of problems. So like Health and Human Services, for instance, if they start to do things like stripping away religious exemptions, and just creating a whole bunch of conflicts, like trying to publicly fund abortion, yeah, that's just salt in wounds, or particularly the trying to force public funding for abortion, trying to regulate how religious schools do hiring in accordance with the anti-discrimination law. That's going to be a huge problem if that's pushed. So the conflicts on sort of the sexual morality and anti-discrimination issues is just been raw ever since the contraception mandate and Obergefell. I think that I was very opposed to the attacks on the religious groups that saw in the Obama administration. Obergefell was, this is, I think, in balance, a good thing. There were worries in the case where the thought was, well, is this just going to be same-sex marriage, or what's going to happen to the people who disagree? And the Solicitor General was like, yeah, it's going to be a problem. So, I think the optimal policy from my perspective would have been like to privatize marriage, but given that that was never going to happen, it would be better to have same-sex marriage with religious exemptions. But I worry, like under the Democrats, there's going to be a lot of attempts to undermine the religious exemptions. I think the religious exemptions are essential when you're changing power structures. So from the sort of Christian-dominated elites of the past to the secular-dominated elites, exemptions allow there to be transfers and relative differences in power, where people feel like, okay, look, at least I can do my own thing. You know what I mean? But if the sense is that no, I'm going to be drug along to this no matter what, then the thought is, well, maybe if Trump runs in 2024, I better look at him closely again. I know a lot of Christians. As a Christian myself, I didn't really face the temptation exactly because I just have such a weird set of political views compared to most people. But a lot of there was like, yeah, I don't like Trump as a person, but I'm just terrified of what's going to happen to the Democrats getting power. Some of that was like overly apocalyptic thinking, like, Biden is not a socialist. I've heard people say, oh, he's such a scary socialist.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No, the biggest problem with Biden, from my perspective, is he's just going to bring all the old, pro-war people back in. That's the biggest thing we've got to worry about. He's just going to destroy a country. I mean, at least Trump didn't destroy a country, like Obama with Libya, or W with Iraq, or whatever. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things I'm really worried about, is the relationship between religious conservatives and the LGBT community, because neither one of those communities is going away. No. And we just absolutely have to learn to live together. So that's something I've done a lot of thinking about. I mean, as someone who's been in liberty circles for a while, like the two of us, we know lots of people that are gay and lesbian, but oftentimes we've hung out with people on the right. So we maybe not religious conservatives ourselves, but we know them, we interact with them. Right? And so, what my life is, has both kind of sides to this. And I just think, really, we just don't need to hate each other and tear each other to pieces. There are lots of ways that through individual liberty and group liberty that we just don't have to fight. And both groups can say, look, I really dislike their values, but they're not going away. Trying to destroy them will just backfire, and let's just move on.
Right.
Right. And that's what liberty allows you to do, right? It allows you to move on. Right. Whereas if we have to make a collective decision that's imposed on everybody, you can't move on because your fundamental values are at stake.
Right. And it just breeds more animosity between one group or another.
That's right. That's
So
right.
to drive this home, Kevin, a lot of what I get out of this, and I argue with I butt heads with a lot of libertarians on this quite often, especially around election seasons, is that the change has to come, and it has to come in focused, targeted, incremental changes. Correct?
Yes. I'm very much of the reformist side of sort of limited government folks, in part because I think radical moves often can backfire, even if they're in the right direction. So, and I think that's happened. Like, I think a lot of the privatizations that were attempted were good ideas, but because, like the way that the particular cultures worked, that ended up being rent-seeking and graft rather than real markets. So, I think a lot of the big lurches in our direction can go wrong, and then we've undermined our own goals.
Right. It's like if you don't plan and pay attention to the little details, that the bigger picture gets swallowed up, and you're stuck with things that you could have planned for, things that you could have seen. Yeah, but you didn't take the time and you didn't take the consideration of it.
Yeah. Or even the big things, right? Russia was communist for 80 years. No one knew how to run a business. I mean, so of course it's going to go to a few guys that, have been interacting on the international markets that run natural resource firms and stuff like that. I actually knew what they were doing to get involved. Um, so, Russia, the USSR dying was one of the great achievements of human history, greatest achievements in human history, because it was one of the most evil regimes that had ever existed in the history of the human race. But the move could have been more effective, so, particularly when we think about privatizations and deregulations, we want to make sure that the cultural preconditions are present, right? So in many cases, it's not just attending to the details; it's attending to even like the whole picture, because property rights are a kind of culture, and we have to cultivate certain cultural norms in order for real property rights to take hold and stay around. In the US, it's a lot easier to do because entrepreneurship is not just common, but it's respected. Um, Even a lot on the left. Yeah, I think that we have to be just subtler in who we trust and who we distrust. We have to be subtler in looking at the institutional conditions when we try to move policy in our direction.
Absolutely. Well, Kevin, I've had you for nearly almost an hour now.
Oh
I
dear.
could probably, I could probably go even longer with you, man.
Yeah,
I
yeah, it's been
appreciate,
fun. Yeah.
yeah, I appreciate everything that you've put out there. Before I let you go off, though, this is your chance to throw out any social media where
Uh-huh.
people
Uh-huh.
can pick up copies of this book.
Okay, so to find me, just do this. You can go to my first and last name.com, kevinvallier.com. You'll see a link to my book, Trust in a Polarized Age. You just scroll down, and there's 30% off from Oxford. You can get the book for $25. And it's just a big discussion of trust and polarization and how we can reform institutions to get trust back. So even if you're not into the moral part of the argument, there's a lot of data there that I think you'll get a lot out of to engage. As far as just me on social in general, you can follow me on Twitter at kvallier, Kvallier, and you can look me up on Facebook. I have a public profile. You can friend me there. I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't do as much with that. And then you can look at my blog, Reconciled, which is just kevinvallier.com/reconciled, and you can add that to your RSS feed. So I can be emailed to at kevinvallier@gmail.com. So I'm very easy to find.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.